Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have a special episode. We're honored by having Jeffrey Kripal, who is a professor at Rice University, he's the Associate Dean of the Humanities, and J. Newton Razor Chair of Philosophy and Religious Thought. So welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, James. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and again, it's a true honor to have you on. And just for people watching and listening, Jeffrey is going to be at our event on Saturday, December 3rd in New York City, entitled again, An Inquiry into Anomalous Experiences and the Phenomenon. So be sure to look in the description for tickets to that, because there's going to be an in-person and live stream. So it's going to be an honor having you there as well, Jeff.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fun. I haven't been to New York City since COVID, actually. So it's going to be fun to be back in the city.
Yeah, and again, I think it's important that there's events like that in New York City, because I had for many years I couldn't go to any events because there weren't any in New York City or the East Coast. So Jay and I are doing it, and we have some co-hosts, Priscilla and Kelly, and the last one was fantastic, and I'm looking forward to this one. And having you there to set the tone is incredible, because your work, if people are not familiar with, hopefully after this episode they are, and they do some digging, because it's actually amazing to me, Jeff, that you've gone under the radar as much as you have and as long as you have. And I'm not saying this in like a pejorative way, but I think it's mostly because in some ways you go over people's heads.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And your work is truly brilliant, and I think it's about time that people recognize or realize and kind of like see its place. And I think that's going to occur. And again, I think having you at this event is going to help communicate that to the larger UFO community as well.
I hope so. I've tried for about 17 years now to reach bigger and bigger publics, and I've failed miserably, but that's okay. We'll click it at some point.
Maybe it's by some kind of greater design, I don't know. But there's going to be a retrocausal effect here. And so I'm going to have to start out with the most important question first, and that's, where do you get your shirts?
So first of all, I gave a talk once. It was on the spiritual but not religious, by the way. I gave it at Arizona State University, I think is where it was from, and we beamed it all over the world, and we're in the hopes of getting profound questions. And I got one question, and that was the question: where did you get the shirt? And the answer is very simple. I got it across from security in Bush Airport in Houston. There's a shop called Pinto Ranch, which I assume I can say online, and that's where I buy my shirts.
Everybody's gonna have to Amazon that now. No, but and so in all seriousness, now you've been involved. You've had a number of books that in different communities have been very profound. You wrote the book Mutants and Mystics, The Flip, Supernatural, 2 words, and a number of other books, and now you have a new book called The Superhumanities. So just for people listening to get a sense of your work, I guess I don't want to be too general either, but what would you consider the focus of your work?
Yeah, I get that one a lot. I always struggle with it. I've worked on a lot of different things. In my early life, I worked on male sexual orientation and ecstatic religious experience, by the way, which was seemingly very far from this topic, but actually not. And now I work on what most people would think of as the paranormal. I think what links all these topics, and I'm looking back now, James, I wouldn't have been able to answer this question 15 years ago. I think what links all these topics is the insistence that the interior world of the human being and the exterior world of the cosmos or universe are not unrelated. That distinction between the inside and the outside is finally a false one. And so I'm interested in people's experiences when that inside and outside come together. And it's often very confusing to people. It's confusing to the experiencers. It's confusing to me, by the way. But that's what I like. I like to be confused, and I like to try to understand things I don't understand, or no one else does either. So I think that's the link. How do we understand things we can't understand?
Yeah, and some people have equated contact experiences and UFO experiences somewhat to religious experiences. And when I say religious experiences, I don't mean dogmatic experiences. I mean just what we would consider of a religious nature, because that's kind of, how else do you classify the supernatural other than a spiritual context, basically the unknown or metaphysical. So how did you find yourself kind of involved here with UFOs and even Whitley Strieber, because you co-authored a book with him? How did you get involved directly with UFOs?
Yeah, so I was not interested in UFOs as a young man. I I was a comic book geek as a kid, by the way. I grew up in the 60s and 70s and read a lot of Marvel comics when they were not appropriate and they were not certainly box office blockbusters. They were just little paper thingamajigs you bought in a drugstore, by the way, where your dad bought pornography, presumably, or that's what you were told anyway. So I mean, these were inappropriate genres. I didn't have any interest in the UFO. I remember when Whitley Strieber's Communion came out in '87. I remember seeing it in the bookstores. I just had no interest in it. I was interested in other things. What happened was I was writing a history of the American counterculture and a place called the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. And people were telling me all kinds of extraordinary experiences they had. And I realized with something of a shock that they were telling me the truth. I had been trained in a field to study religion that basically looks at all this stuff as legends or as exaggerations or as ways to accrue power. And I realized that these people were not trying to do any of that, and that they were trying to tell me about encountering a ghost or having a Kundalini awakening in childbirth or having a psychedelic trip or seeing a UFO or a ball of light, and that all of these things in fact really happened. And I was shocked by that. I wasn't unsympathetic. I was very sympathetic, but I was intellectually shocked by it. And so I just got really interested in that shock or that surprise and started to pursue it. And one rabbit hole led to another rabbit hole, and pretty soon I was in the UFO world. I see the UFO in religious terms. There's no doubt about it. And by that, I mean, by religion, I don't mean, your church or your synagogue or temple. I mean, asking ultimate questions. Why are we here? What's the purpose of the human life? What happens to us after we die? What is the nature of God or ultimate reality? These are classical kind of religious questions. And I think the UFO phenomenon doesn't answer those, but it helps people to ask those in better ways, and it shocks them out of their secular materialist physicalist boxes. And so that's why I'm interested in it. That's how I got into it. I've probably been involved with it since about 2008, 2009. I wrote a book called Authors of the Impossible, which features chapters on Jacques Vallée and Bertrand Must, both of whom are very important thinkers, French thinkers about the UFO. So that's really the origins of my interest.
Yeah, and since you've gotten involved back then, I guess in around 2008 or so, is there anything that that you've changed your mind on about UFOs in particular, or anything that was maybe surprising or something you had to rethink?
Amy Michel, who was this French writer, he used to say that when you start out studying UFOs, you're studying physics and astronomy, and you end up studying dead Arabic mystics. And I think there's something to that, actually. You sort of begin with this literalist, physicalist understanding, and it's not that it's not that you abandon the physicalist component of it, but you move more and more to a worldview that is not strictly physicalist or materialist. And has anything really changed or has been surprised me? I don't know, actually, because I started out studying mystical literature. I studied out studying dead Arabic mystics. So I don't know, actually, if I have been surprised, although I've been very moved by the way the public and the media and the military have changed their tunes, changed their perceptions of it. I mean, a lot has happened since '08, as you know. I mean, the public perception of this and the government conversation around it has dramatically shifted, particularly since late 2017, which I'm sure your viewers are aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, two people, or actually three people that are going to be at the conference in December were kind of instrumental in that article occurring. Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Christopher Mellon, who kind of got the tapes out in a roundabout way to them. And there it's on the New York Times.
They weren't
Yeah.
kind of involved. Those
Yeah, right.
Those were those were not even players. I mean, those were three people who did
Movers.
it. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, really, there were just four people, right? And
Helena Cooper. Yeah.
you have three of them in the room together. So I would say that's way more than kind of. I would say they actually did that.
They did. Yeah. And it's the first time that they've been together, especially at a conference ever, I think, number one. Number two, especially it's going to be the 5-year anniversary, basically, a few days short of the 5-year anniversary of that. And so since you came at it from the almost a mystical aspect, or the supernatural aspect, two words, were you surprised at all when on the other side of it, with like the physicality of it, like, oh my God, there actually is a cover up. Oh my God, there actually are potential materials and off-world vehicles, and there is a cover up and government involvement. Did that part surprise you at all? Or, did your comics desensitize you to that kind of stuff?
So, yeah. So by mystical, mystical is from a Greek adjective, mystikos, and it means secret or hidden. And it usually refers to some kind of secret or hidden identity between the human person and the universe. Okay. Now, having said that, all of these literatures are very esoteric in a social or political sense. In other words, they're wrapped in secrecy. And a lot of the historical mystics were persecuted and sometimes even killed by their religious colleagues. So I was very used to seeing the truth of human experience be suppressed or hidden or distorted. When I look at the UFO phenomenon today, I have a lot of suspicion, James. Certainly as a researcher, the number one rule is you need free access to whatever it is you're studying. And we just don't have that here. We're just constantly hitting walls of security and security clearances and secrecy. And so we can't really study this stuff freely. And I think that's the first thing that needs to happen. But none of that surprises me, because that's been the history of mystical literature for hundreds, if not thousands of years. There's always been these walls of secrecy put between it and certainly the people or the public. So no, that didn't surprise me. The physical aspect, there's always been physical aspects of mystical experience, human beings levitating and objects appearing in the sky and signs implanted in people's bodies. So none of this is actually new. And I'm not claiming some kind of originality or some kind of erudition here. I'm just saying it looks very familiar to me, to answer your question.
Yeah. And, something you kind of touched on before was that the UFO phenomenon has a way of like shaking people out of there every day. And that's a little bit, on the extreme side, what you wrote about in your book, The Flip. And I think that the UFO phenomenon has the potential to kind of do that on different levels. Whether you have a contact experience, it's going to cause kind of the flip kind of aspect. So what's your thinking on, the UFO phenomenon and that kind of ability to transform, people's paradigms?
So to me, that's what's most interesting about the UFO phenomenon. John Mack called it ontological shock. And what he meant by that is that the people who have had these experiences are essentially traumatized or emotionally shocked that reality is not what they thought it was, that there are these dimensions or aspects to the world that the person just had no inkling of before. To me, that's a sign of a real experience. That's a sign of a very honest human being, that there's some kind of experience that does not fit into the cultural worldview or the religious tradition or whatever it is. As a student of religious experience, I'm always a bit suspicious of religious experiences that just confirm the religion. That's what you expect, right?
Yeah.
So when you get something that doesn't confirm the worldview or the tradition, I'm like, hey, that's really interesting. That's probably really happened that way. And so my ears perk up, and I guess I listen more. But I think that shock, that metaphysical or ontological shock, is at the core of this, James. And that's really what I think is most interesting about it.
Yeah, I agree. And, I've often said that, the UFO phenomenon is kind of like a bridge between physics and metaphysics, because it has that ability to be a physical object that we can see, track on radar, track on gun camera footage and so on. Yet it's demonstrating these, seemingly metaphysical properties, or AKA aspects of physics that we don't understand yet, that don't fit. And I do think that the UFO phenomenon, in a sense, is a wake-up call, but it's a very visceral one. Again, because it's seemingly something that's supernatural, but undeniable at the same time. But I'm curious as to your thoughts on a few kind of very UFO central questions. What are your thoughts on, say, like crash retrievals, right?
Yeah. So again, as someone who does actual historical research, the number one rule again is to have access to all the information or all the data, and to be able to put that in a footnote. I mean, it sounds nerdy, but the purpose of footnotes is so other people can go and check your sources. And with all this, a lot of this stuff, you have none of that. And so as a researcher, my suspicions are always raised. It's not that I know it's not true or it's not real. That's not what I'm saying. It's that if you don't have access to something, you can't study it, and you can't do it in a community. Scholarship advances because it's in a community of scholars that can check each other and challenge each other and have conversations. And we can't do any of that here. So I guess, is that a complaint, or am I being crabby? I don't know, James. I'm just observing what I think is obviously the case. If someone comes out and says, here are the objects that were retrieved from the crash, and they're definitely anomalous, fantastic. Let's look at them and let's think about that. But I guess I'm surprised by how little that happens.
Yeah. And of course, people listening will know that there's been new language drafted in the intelligence bill for 2023 that's asking for NDAs, physical materials. They want to know how and if and why that the government or the Air Force, or who have you, have influenced public opinion on the UFO phenomenon, and they want to know about the physiological effects and all that. So
James, let me say this about the military stuff, because I think it'll get at your question really well. people, I mean, I think too often we assume that data or information drives theory or model building, where in fact your model or your theory will determine what data you look at. And so we have this funny saying that if all you have is a hammer, all you will see are nails. In other words, you're just going to pound the nails with your hammer. You're not going to see anything, and you're not going to do anything that isn't a hammer and a nail. And with the military stuff, I mean, the military's job is to protect the nation state, right? It's to protect the airspace. And so it's going to frame the UFO as a potential threat. Well, it may not be a threat, I mean, there's a lot of aspects of it that aren't very threatening at all, but it's going to frame it. It's got that hammer, and so it's going to find that nail, and it's going to keep hitting on those nails. And as someone who again works with different theories and models, I'm like, your model's going to determine what you're going to see. So maybe you need a different theory or a model. And the example I give here, let me just bring this home. The example I always give is Arrival, the movie.
Fantastic one. Yeah.
Right? So if you look at UFO movies before Arrival, what do you see? You see what I call the Cold War invasion story, right? It's always the alien coming from outside, and the great patriot or Americans got to fight back against this evil alien intruder. And by the way, the word alien meant immigrant in the 19th century, right? Come on. So
Yeah.
so what you have in Arrival is a very conscious break with that Cold War invasion story. The military, if you remember the movie, the military is there, but it stands back and it does not act. And what Louise, the central character, realizes, she's a translator, by the way, she's not a hard scientist. Her expertise is communication, and she realizes that the alien presence, their language is circular because time is circular, and her first interpretation is that they're telling her to use the weapon, which is the old Cold War narrative, and then she realizes that's wrong, and that what they're actually saying is use your gift, right? In other words, be precognitive. And to me, that's the shift. That's the shift in these two stories. Use your weapon is the old Cold War, fight the alien narrative, and use your gift, understand that time is circular and that we're precognitive, and that we somehow share something with this alien presence, and it's about the future of humanity, but also the future of this presence, is a much more positive, and I think much more creative story. I'm not saying which story is correct. It's not about being correct here. It's which story are we going to live in? And I do think it sounds nerdy, James, but I do think we're living in a story, and that story is telling us, and that's a problem. And I think this UFO thing is trying to kick us out of our story, essentially.
Yeah.
That's
the super story.
Yeah, that's
Super
what
story.
I call the super story. It's trying to push us. It's trying to make us aware that, hey, we're in a story. It may not be such a good story. It's doing bad things to people. It's doing bad things to the environment. Let's tell a different story.
Yeah. So this is kind of a broad question, but I know you can zero in on what I'm getting at is, you talked about the military aspect. So how can academics, like, yourself has been involved, like how can academics get involved? And then there's the broader question of, science and not versus, but you have science and you have the humanities, kind of like what you pointed out with one of the characters.
Yeah.
So how can academics get involved in the subject if they don't necessarily, if the government's not handing them the saucer or what have you? How can an academic approach the subject? And this kind of will get a little into, I think, that how you started off the Superhumanities with the Clark Kent and Superman analogy, which I thought was absolutely beautiful. So thank you for that. But again, the academics, how can they get involved?
So I think by academic, you mean humanities. You mean somebody who's not a hard scientist. The they just announced, NASA just announced this team of specialists to study the UAP problem. And I looked at the list and it didn't surprise me. There's not a single historian or philosopher or humanist or scholar of religion on that team. They're all hard sciences, which means they think this is a hard physical object and that the hard sciences are the best way to study it. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying, look, if you're going to really study the phenomena, you also have to study the human side of this and the paranormal effects this often has on human beings. You have to take the whole phenomenon in. You can't just slice it up and study the things that you can manipulate and measure and turn into math. You're not going to understand it. You're going to just, it's just a hammer again. You're just going to find a bunch of nails. So the answer to your question is, this is going to sound really self-serving, but you have to frickin' hire us. You you have to spend money on people to be on these research teams. You actually have to produce funding to do this right. And by the way, the reason the sciences work so well is there's billions of dollars behind it. They can hire people to work on these things for their whole lives, and then they can hire generations of researchers. We don't have any of that really in these other fields. And so I'm not arguing for myself. I'm arguing for our culture to be smarter about this and to invest in forms of research and forms of inquiry that are just not about objects and machines in the sky, that are also about people and you know, in the case of Arrival, that are about the circularity of time and precognition and all of these things that are also, frankly, part of the phenomenon.
So is there anything that, I don't want to say like a casual academic, but if say somebody's going, you know, across their academic life, is there a way that they could contribute to?
Yeah, I mean, so listen, I've spent 15 years now going around mostly the US and Europe, lecturing on this stuff in mostly universities, not always, but mostly. And what I find over and over again is that academics are basically in the closet on this, by which I mean they actually don't resist it, don't disagree, but they don't also know how to talk about it. And they fear for whatever little respectability they have in the culture. And by the way, the scientists fear the same thing, you know, but they have a lot of respectability and a lot of social capital to lose if they come out in the wrong way on this topic. So people are afraid. And I think understandably so. So my answer to your question would be, let's remove the fear factor. You know, let's create a culture in which it's okay to study this stuff. And it's also okay to make mistakes, by the way. I think it's really important that we make mistakes and that we're comfortable making mistakes and we understand that's part of the learning process. James, I don't trust people who are certain about anything. I think certainty is a clear sign of being wrong. Or being stubborn, and doubt and questioning are always signs of intelligence and a kind of future-oriented progress for me.
Yeah, and it's funny, yeah, because I think you just wrote a blurb for Mitch Horowitz's book, Uncertain Places.
Yeah,
Speaking of uncertain,
yeah,
who was at our last event and gave a great talk on ESP and extraphysical reality. But the so academics can you know, I think that everything that's going on now, there's a greater atmosphere for people to talk about this now, thanks to people like, you know, yourself, Diana Pasulka, who wrote American Cosmic, and came out very publicly in that way and showed research for it. Dr. Gary Nolan, who he is a scientist, and he's very open about it, including his own experiences, which is pretty incredible. So I do think we're getting there. But as far as where the conversation is going, as a whole, where do you see everything going, even with like the so-called disclosure process and everything going on with that? Do you think things are in a better place than they were?
I think they're definitely in a better place, because again, the 2017 New York Times pieces has really opened up the subject in a way it was not before. So yes, things are getting better. There's more conversation. My hope for the conversation is that, to go back to Amy Michelle, we can move from physics and astronomy to, Arabic mystics. I hope we can take in more of the phenomenon and not just look at the stuff that we can understand, with the telescope, as it were. I think that is happening. I was very heartened. If you actually read the literature around the research that the New York Times article is about, I mean, those researchers have written a book called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. And one of the things they're adamant about is that there's no way to understand the UFO phenomenon without understanding the paranormal or the occult, that these things are not separate. And I think that just shatters again, or fries all of our circuits. So all the better. Let them fry. Let them blow. I mean, I think that's what a good intellectual or a good, honest human being is all about. And by the way, academics are just people, James. We're just ordinary people who for a lot of luck get paid to think and teach and write about these things. And so we are the people just doing this. So but I hope that's where the conversation goes. I hope the table gets bigger and we put more things on the table, and we stop taking things off the table and making the table smaller. That would be my metaphor, my summary.
Yeah. Do you foresee any kind of roadblocks where it's just like the whole thing just gets jammed up?
Yes. It's my own, this is a feeling, or I don't know what this is. Is this an intuition or a conviction? I don't know. Anyway, it's my position is that the phenomenon itself is elusive and trickster-like. It's messing with us. And the idea that we can somehow understand it or explain it or frankly disclose it, even if we disclosed it, so what? That doesn't mean we understand it. And we may be disclosing precisely that which wants to be disclosed as opposed to what doesn't want to be disclosed. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's something really trickster-like about this. And I think the student of religion and folklore and mythology, the first thing such a person would tell you is be careful. Don't believe everything you believe. Don't think everything you think. Stop it. Be careful here. I'll just give you an image. I like to give you images. This is 120 years ago now, 110 years ago. William James was a philosopher and a psychologist at Harvard, and he was studying psychical phenomena. He was studying mediums and seances and things. And he basically concluded that we're like cats sleeping in a library. The cat no more knows what's in those books than, man on the moon, as we used to say. The cat cannot understand what's in those books. All the cat can do is sleep on the books. And so I think we have to entertain the possibility that we're like those cats. And we cannot read the books, not because we're not allowed to, but because we don't have the capacity to.
Yeah, we're just cats.
We're just cats. We didn't write or read them. So that's a tough one. That's hard to hear. But I think that's a possibility here that we have to like seriously entertain. And people who have been in this biz a lot longer than I have said very similar things, James. I mean,
Yeah,
if you listen to Jacques Vallée, this is essentially what Jacques says. It's like, just
yeah,
be careful. Don't assume you understand what's going on, or you will ever understand. He doesn't. He'll be the
right.
first person to tell you he doesn't know what a UFO is, and he's been at it, what, 70 years now, 60
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, and that's actually getting to the next question I wanted to ask is, when it comes to the UFO phenomenon, and the question if we're even capable of beginning to understand what it is represents. There's this question of, Vallée has the control hypothesis, and with that comes the question is, are we being guided or manipulated, and what's the difference?
Yeah. I wrote a book called Authors of the Impossible, and the basic argument of it is we're being written. And I don't mean our DNA, which, by the way, might be another way of being written. I mean,
Yeah,
they call them letters, for God's sake.
yeah,
I mean, if you live inside a culture or you live inside a religion, and most people do, they live in one of those, they're being written. You're born into a language. You don't invent a language. You're born into a culture. You don't invent a culture. And you just assume that that's the way things really are. But it's not true. It's not true. And this is where the comparative study of religion or folklore comes in. That so-called academic or that nerd, they know very well that there is no religious or folklore or mythological worldview that's totally true or totally adequate. They know that they're all limited. And so there's a kind of stepping back, a kind of humble transcendence that takes place, I think. And so that's what, when I look at the UFO world, I see that. I like, wow, you really believe this, don't you? And it's not that I don't think the phenomena happens. It happens. It's real. But that doesn't mean I believe the beliefs that it generates. And I would say the same thing about any religious worldview or any folklore, any mythology, any. I'm not being unfair or selective here. But again, that's really a hard thing for people to hear. Unless you're unless you study religion and folklore for a living, then you're like, yeah, sure, of course. Duh.
yeah, yeah. And that is very like passport to Magonia.
Yeah.
And so I have kind of a one-off question here. And it's just kind of random, but I'm interested in if you have any perspective on it. There's something that's known as the Wilson Davis memo or the Wilson Davis notes, where allegedly, Dr. Davis had a conversation with Vice Admiral Tom Wilson in 2002. Do you have any insight or thoughts on that?
No, I don't. I will say this though. So we're building what I'm calling the Archives of the Impossible at Rice University. We do not have the letters or original memos of that particular event, but there's a lot of correspondence and memos of other events in there. And so what I'm trying to say is, if we want to get to the bottom of a lot of this stuff historically, we're going to need some archival research. We're going to need hard work to do that. I don't know what to say about this event because I don't have access to those documents.
Are you familiar with the all of the contents of the archive?
Of course not.
Okay,
Of
because
course not. I mean, that's not possible. Again,
it's impossible. That's why it's impossible.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm estimating there's at least 500,000 to 1,000,000
Oh
documents in
wow.
there now.
Okay.
So
There's
yeah.
there's one important. I mean, again, it's important. Is it important, or is it just another thing thrown out there that we're trying to understand, but it really does not mean something in the bigger picture? I don't know. But I say it's important because Jacques Vallée wrote about it. And he seemed surprised by it. And in his volume 4 of Forbidden Science, he wrote that he had secured a document that the CIA was involved in simulating UFO abductions in South America, in Brazil and Argentina. Does that ring any bells?
Well, it rings bells in this sense. If you work, I mean, I do work in our archives. I mean, I do try to understand what's in there. And the longer you're in those archives, the more I think you're schooled in deception. And the more you are suspicious of particular cases or particular stories you hear. So do I have information on that particular case? Again, no, I'm not aware of any, although it might be in the archives. I mean, I don't know.
I yeah,
I mean, we have Jacques Vallée's papers, by the way.
exactly. That's why, yeah.
But they're on moratorium. You know, they're on moratorium for 10 years from the date they were given, and for good reason. I mean, I think this is part of the reason is there is information in there that is sensitive, and you know, I think that needs to be honored. So again, it gets back to this point I tried to make earlier. If we want to get to the bottom, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of this, but if we want a fuller understanding, we're going to have to do the hard historical research. And we just haven't done that, James. We haven't done that. And the other thing I'll say is, I think there's a lot of, how should I put this? There's a lot of obeisance or reverence even for the military and the intelligence communities, as if they somehow know the truth. I actually don't think they know the truth of this. I actually don't think I don't think anybody knows the truth. And I don't think it actually has anything whatsoever to do with the Pentagon or the military at the end of the day. I think the phenomena has been with the human species for as far as we can see back, way before there was a Pentagon or a CIA or anything else, even a United States of America. I mean, this thing goes back thousands of years, as far as we can see, probably goes back hundreds of thousands of years, as farther we can see back. So I just don't want to locate it in a particular document or an exchange or something a physicist said to a general. I mean, so what? I just don't think those are the people that are going to crack the code here. I think you're going to need a much bigger team, as it were.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. But I think a lot of people see that as like, you know, if there was, let's just speculate and say there was a crash retrieval and there were some kind of entities, whether, again, if they are actually represent the phenomenon or just something manufactured or, you know, what have you. I think they would see that as like, this is the proof that there's something else, that there's the other. And people are desperate for that kind of assurance.
I get that. And I think that's important. What I'm trying to say, though, is, you know, people will often ask me, they'll tell me some precognitive dream or some telepathic event that occurred to them, and it'll be very banal and very maybe even silly and funny, and they're like, why did that happen? and my response is always to tell you that you're connected to things and to other people in a way that you were not aware of. It's not the phenomena themselves. It's not the funny song you heard before it played on the radio, or it's not the plane crash you saw in your dream before it happened the next day. It's the fact that you can see or understand what's going to happen before it happens. That's the message. And I think with these UFO events, I think it's a similar kind of shock. It's not the recovered material or the recovered craft, if there are any. It's the fact that there is material and that there are craft.
Yeah.
And please, I mean, you know, Jacques Vallée and Paolo Leopizzi Harris wrote this book called Trinity, which you're probably aware of. And the point that Jacques makes in it is, this so-called crash, this so-called crashed saucer looks a lot like the atomic bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it in fact happened just before we dropped them. So is this crashed vehicle an actual vehicle? If so, why are there no toilets? Why is there nothing inside, that you would expect in a ship? Why does this thing look like a symbol? It looks like a mode of communication, but it's not, it can only be read as a spaceship with the biggest stretches of the imagination. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. Even if we recover something or something crashes, it doesn't mean what someone says it is. It might mean something entirely different. When I play with a laser with my pet cat on the wall, that cat thinks one thing. I'm thinking an entirely different thing. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to say, is this communication that's going on, or that's presumably going on, may not be clear at all. I just want us to be really savvy about that.
Yeah. And I kind of jokingly made a video called Contact and Stream Entry, and kind of like the idea that a contact experience is like the kind of like very beginning for some people as an awakening,
Yeah.
as a precognitive experience can be, or an event like that. It's like the beginning of an awakening experiences, to kind of like open your consciousness to again what we can call the greater reality, but is really just reality itself. But getting to the archives of the impossible, are there going to be other such events?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going to do another big one in the spring, by the way. We don't have a date yet, but we're thinking in May. And the first time we did this was last March. It was still during COVID, and we had 1,700 people register and almost 200 people show up. And we had 150,000 views within a couple of weeks when we posted it. So it was a very significant event, I think, for the community. And we want to keep that momentum going, and we want to expand it. So we want to do it again this spring, and hopefully we'll have, way more than 1,700 people register, and we'll have more than 200 people show up. And it'll just get, bigger, and the conversation will push out into other universities and other publics.
Yeah. And is it also just going to be called Archives of the Impossible?
Is it what?
Is it going to have the same name?
Well, yeah, we're gonna use Archives of the Impossible as our physical kind of hook, or the flag we plant, but each conference will be about something different. It's not gonna be about the archives. Let me put it that way. It'll try to extend this conversation wherever it wants to go. We'll see where it wants to go in next year.
Yeah. Well, and again, the event that we're doing, an inquiry into anomalous experiences and the phenomenon, was definitely in some ways kind of inspired by Archives of the Impossible and Esalen and the Invisible College, things like that, and having those kind of dialogues very publicly.
Well, yeah, Jay was there, of course, and so was Leslie.
Yeah.
Chris wasn't, but he certainly knew about it.
Yeah.
We had a wonderful time, and I think the donors themselves, the material donors now to the archive, I think they were deeply moved by the event, because it was apparent to everyone that we were treating this very seriously, and we intended to preserve all of this and to extend this conversation over many generations. And it's not a one-off, James. I don't think any of these things are one-off. I think we either do this together or we don't do it at all.
For sure. And just two more questions, because I know you're pressed for time. Do you have any other projects that people should be looking forward to? I know you just released a book called The Superhumanities, so everybody go check that out. I'll put a link in the description. But is there any other books or projects that you're currently working on?
Well, the Superhumanities is essentially an argument. We're taking this stuff and mainstreaming it into higher education That's certainly one of the projects. The Archives of the Impossible is sort of another dimension of this same project. Between us two things, I'm pretty busy, James. It's as much as I can do, I'm afraid. I think that's probably a lot or enough for now.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm just for people listening
No,
and watching.
I don't have anything else that, I mean, I speak and show up all the time at events, but your event in December is the next thing I'm going to for sure.
Yeah, and I'm really appreciative that you're coming to that. It's going to be fantastic. And do you have any parting words for the audience?
Don't believe your beliefs.
Awesome.
Yes, just step out of yourself and step out of whatever your worldview is. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's hard science. Step out of it.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Jeffrey. It's been an honor speaking to you, and I really look forward to meeting you in person on December 3rd and getting to talk with you and hearing your talk as well.
Me too, James. Looking forward.
Definitely. All right. You have a great day. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.